The goodbye message that shatters every avoidant. Imagine spending months carrying a key in your pocket, completely convinced that a certain door will always be there whenever you decide to open it. You don't think about the key much because you never have to. The door has always remained where it was. The possibility has always existed. The connection has always felt available, even during periods of distance. Then one day, without warning, you walk back to that door and discover something unsettling. The door isn't locked. It isn't damaged. It isn't even guarded. It's simply gone. That's the feeling many avoidants are completely unprepared for. Not because someone fought harder, not because someone finally found the perfect argument, but because someone quietly accepted reality and walked away with dignity. People often assume avoidants are immune to goodbyes. They see the withdrawal, the emotional distance, the hesitation around commitment, and conclude that endings must be easier for them. Yet what many fail to understand is that avoidants spend years preparing themselves for emotional pressure, emotional demands, emotional confrontations, and emotional pursuits. They're ready for the messages filled with pain. They're ready for the late-night attempts to fix everything. They're ready for the emotional negotiations. What they're often not ready for is a goodbye that carries no desperation at all, a goodbye that doesn't beg, a goodbye that doesn't chase, a goodbye that simply accepts what is and releases what cannot be changed. And if you've ever found yourself wondering why certain endings seem to linger in someone's mind far longer than expected, stay with me because what we're about to explore may completely change how you understand closure. And while you're here, make sure you're subscribed. If these conversations help you understand the hidden psychology behind relationships in a way few people ever explain, you'll want to be here for the next one. The truth is that most goodbye messages fail before they're even sent. Not because the emotions behind them aren't real, but because they often come from a place of emotional overload rather than emotional clarity. When people feel abandoned, confused, heartbroken, or desperate for answers, they naturally want to express everything they're carrying. They write long messages explaining their pain. They try to convince the other person to understand. They list every sacrifice, every memory, every reason the relationship should continue, and while those feelings are completely human, they often have a surprising effect on avoidance. Instead of creating connection, they can activate defenses. Instead of creating reflection, they can create distance. That's because avoidants have spent much of their lives learning how to protect themselves from emotional intensity. The moment a conversation feels overwhelming, their instinct often isn't to move closer, it's to create space. So when a goodbye message arrives loaded with emotional urgency, many avoidants unconsciously process it as another situation they need to escape from rather than absorb. This is why so many people feel devastated when they pour their heart into a farewell only to receive a cold response, a delayed response, or no response at all. They assume their words lacked meaning. They assume the relationship never mattered. But often the deeper issue is that the message arrived in a form the avoidant already knew how to defend against. The emotion was real. The impact simply wasn't reaching the place they hoped it would. What's fascinating is that many avoidants secretly expect a very specific sequence of events when relationships begin falling apart. They may never consciously think about it, but over time certain patterns become familiar. They expect difficult conversations, they expect emotional reactions, they expect attempts to repair the connection, they expect people to keep trying even after receiving mixed signals. In some cases, they even expect cycles of separation and reconciliation because that's what they've experienced before. These expectations create a kind of emotional script. Everyone involved unknowingly plays a role. One person pursues clarity, the other creates distance. One person seeks answers, the other seeks space. The dynamic repeats often enough that it starts feeling predictable. That's why the typical ending rarely surprises them. They've seen versions of it before, they've learned how to navigate it, they know what comes next. But the goodbye message that truly impacts them doesn't follow the script. It arrives from a place they didn't anticipate. It doesn't attempt to negotiate. It doesn't ask for one final chance. It doesn't present an emotional case that needs to be argued. Instead, it communicates something far more unsettling: acceptance. Genuine acceptance removes the emotional game board entirely. There is nothing left to debate, nothing left to postpone, nothing left to strategically manage. The familiar script suddenly ends, and with it disappears the sense of predictability they were relying on. This is where the real power of the unexpected response begins revealing itself. Most people think impact comes from intensity. They assume the louder the goodbye, the deeper the wound, but psychological impact often works differently. Sometimes the most powerful response is the one that refuses to participate in the expected dynamic. Think about how startling it feels when someone remains calm in a situation where everyone expects chaos. That calmness forces people to pay attention because it doesn't fit their expectations. In the same way, a goodbye rooted in peace rather than desperation creates a kind of emotional silence that many avoidants don't know how to categorize. Suddenly, they aren't dealing with someone trying to pull them closer. They're dealing with someone who has accepted the distance. They're not responding to emotional pressure. They're responding to emotional certainty. And certainty can be surprisingly powerful because it communicates something words alone cannot. It communicates that the person sending the message has stopped trying to force an outcome. They've stopped fighting reality. They've stopped asking for permission to move forward. There is a quiet strength in that energy, and strength often leaves a deeper impression than emotional intensity ever could. Not because it punishes the avoidant, but because it reveals that the relationship is no longer being held together by one person's effort alone. Then comes the moment everything changes. The moment when the avoidant begins realizing this goodbye isn't another chapter in the cycle. It isn't a temporary reaction. It isn't a strategy designed to create a response. It's real, and that realization often arrives gradually rather than all at once. At first, there may be assumptions that communication will eventually resume. There may be confidence that the familiar pattern will return. But as time passes, something begins feeling different. The energy behind the goodbye becomes impossible to ignore. The person who once chased answers is no longer chasing. The person who once waited is no longer waiting. The emotional availability that once felt permanent now feels uncertain. And for perhaps the first time, the avoidant finds themselves standing in unfamiliar territory. They are no longer managing distance inside a connection. They are confronting the possibility of an actual ending. That's a completely different psychological experience. Distance can feel temporary. Endings feel final. Distance allows room for assumptions. Endings demand acceptance. And when that distinction becomes clear, the emotional landscape shifts. The goodbye message stops being a conversation and becomes a reality, not because it was cruel, not because it was dramatic, but because it carried something many avoidants rarely expect to encounter, someone who genuinely means goodbye. And that distinction is exactly why the goodbye message that affects an avoidant most deeply is never really about punishment. This is where many people become confused. After being hurt, ignored, disappointed, or emotionally exhausted, it's natural to fantasize about a farewell that finally makes the other person feel what you've felt. It's natural to imagine a message so powerful that it creates instant regret, instant realization, instant accountability. But the goodbye we're talking about here operates on an entirely different level. Its power doesn't come from revenge. It doesn't come from manipulation. It doesn't come from strategically trying to trigger someone's emotions. In fact, the moment a goodbye becomes an attempt to control another person's reaction, it loses the very quality that makes it impactful. True closure isn't focused on changing them, it's focused on accepting reality. That's what makes it so difficult for many avoidants to process. They are often prepared for emotional pressure because pressure still keeps them emotionally relevant to the situation. If someone is pleading, arguing, convincing, or fighting, the dynamic remains active. There is still an emotional rope connecting both people. But when someone genuinely lets go, that rope disappears. There is nothing left to pull against, nothing left to resist, nothing left to escape from. And suddenly the avoidant is faced with something much more challenging than conflict. The reality that another person has stopped organizing their life around the relationship. Not out of anger, not out of spite, but out of self-respect. There is a hidden strength inside that kind of letting go, and it's a strength many people don't recognize until they've lived through it themselves. For a long time, society romanticizes persistence. We celebrate fighting for love. We celebrate never giving up. We celebrate staying committed no matter what obstacles appear. While those qualities can be beautiful in healthy relationships, they become dangerous when directed towards someone who consistently refuses to meet you halfway. Eventually, there comes a point where continuing to fight requires abandoning yourself, and that's the moment everything changes. Because real strength isn't always found in holding on. Sometimes it's found in knowing when holding on is hurting you more than helping you. The goodbye message that leaves a lasting impact isn't the one that says, "Look what you're losing." It's the one that quietly communicates, "I finally understand what I deserve." That energy feels different because it isn't rooted in desperation, it's rooted in clarity. It reflects a person who has stopped trying to force a connection that cannot survive on one person's effort alone. And for many avoidants, encountering that level of emotional maturity can feel surprisingly unsettling. Not because they want to see you suffer, but because your decision forces them to confront a reality they may have been avoiding themselves. The reality that relationships require participation from both people. The reality that patience has limits. The reality that love, no matter how genuine, cannot thrive indefinitely without reciprocity. What's fascinating is that the most powerful goodbye messages often communicate far more than the actual words on the screen. On the surface, the message may sound simple. It may express gratitude, it may acknowledge the relationship, it may wish the other person well, but beneath those words exists a deeper message that doesn't need to be spoken directly. It says, I accept what I cannot change. It says, I am no longer trying to convince you to choose me. It says, I value myself enough to stop fighting for a place where I am not fully welcomed. These messages carry weight because they communicate emotional independence. They reveal a shift from seeking validation to creating it internally. For someone accustomed to dynamics where emotional energy remains available no matter what happens, this shift can be surprisingly powerful. The goodbye no longer feels like a reaction, it feels like a decision, and decisions carry a different emotional gravity than reactions. Reactions can change, reactions can be reversed, reactions can be negotiated. Decisions often signal something more permanent. They suggest that the person has already completed much of the emotional work internally before ever sending the message. And that's exactly why these farewells linger in people's minds. They represent a level of acceptance that cannot easily be challenged. There is no emotional opening to exploit, no argument to win, no uncertainty to manage, just a quiet acknowledgement that the chapter has reached its natural conclusion. Ironically, this is also why avoidants often struggle more with finality than many people realize. On the surface, distance appears comfortable for them. Space appears natural. Independence appears effortless. Yet there is an enormous difference between creating distance and accepting finality. Distance often contains possibility. Finality removes it. Distance says, not right now. Finality says, this may never happen again. That distinction matters. A person can feel completely comfortable with separation as long as they believe the door remains unlocked. The moment that door begins closing, however, the emotional experience changes. Possibility has a strange effect on the human mind. We take comfort in knowing options exist even when we aren't actively using them. That's why genuine goodbyes can feel so unsettling. They transform possibility into consequence. They force people to confront outcomes they previously treated as hypothetical. For many avoidants, this is where the emotional impact begins growing. Not because they suddenly become overwhelmed with regret, but because the situation becomes real in a way it wasn't before. The future they casually assumed might still be available now feels uncertain. The connection they thought could be revisited later now appears less guaranteed. And uncertainty has a way of drawing attention toward things that were previously ignored. Then comes the silence that follows the goodbye, not the silence before it, not the silence during the struggles and confusion, the silence afterward. This silence is different because it contains no unresolved conversation. The message has already been sent, the words have already been spoken. The decision has already been made, there is nothing left to argue against. No emotional crisis demanding an immediate response. No ongoing negotiation keeping the connection active, just stillness. And stillness can be incredibly revealing. Without new conflicts to focus on, the mind begins wandering backward. It revisits memories, it revisits choices, it revisits moments that once seemed ordinary but now feel significant. The avoidant is no longer responding to pressure, they are responding to absence. And absence often creates a level of reflection that active conflict never could. Because when someone is constantly trying to reach you, your attention remains fixed on managing their approach. When they stop reaching altogether, your attention is suddenly free to examine what their presence actually meant. That is where the deeper psychological process begins. Not in the goodbye itself, but in the quiet that follows it. A quiet where there are no distractions left. A quiet where memories become louder. A quiet where questions begin surfacing that weren't there before. And as that silence stretches on, something unexpected starts happening inside them. Thoughts they never intended to entertain begin refusing to leave. The strange thing about unresolved thoughts is that they rarely arrive when people expect them. They don't appear during busy days filled with distractions. They don't usually surface in the middle of conversations or routines. Instead, they tend to emerge during quiet moments when there is nothing left competing for attention. That's often what happens after a goodbye that is truly accepted. The avoidant may initially experience relief, relief that the tension is over, relief that the difficult conversations have ended. relief that there is finally space again, and for a while that relief can feel convincing. It can create the impression that the goodbye was easier than expected, but emotions are rarely that simple. Human beings don't process meaningful relationships in straight lines. They process them in layers, and once the first layer settles, deeper layers often begin revealing themselves. That's when thoughts start appearing that were previously drowned out by the constant movement of the relationship. A memory surfaces unexpectedly. A familiar place triggers a recollection. A small detail brings back an entire moment. Suddenly, the person who seemed absent from their mind begins appearing in ways they never anticipated. Not because they are trying to think about them, but because the mind has finally been given enough stillness to recognize what was lost. And that's where the goodbye begins affecting them differently than they imagined. It stops being about the end of conflict and starts becoming about the absence of connection. What's particularly interesting is how distance changes perception. While a relationship is active, attention often gravitates toward frustrations, disagreements, unmet expectations, and emotional pressure. People become focused on whatever feels difficult in the present moment. But once genuine distance enters the picture, the mind frequently begins reorganizing memories. Events that once felt ordinary become meaningful. Gestures that were overlooked gain significance. The emotional landscape shifts because there is no longer a daily reality competing with reflection. This doesn't mean someone suddenly forgets every challenge that existed. It means the relationship is now being viewed through a different lens. The constant focus on what felt overwhelming begins making room for appreciation of what felt valuable. Many avoidants find themselves surprised by this process because it happens gradually. They may discover themselves remembering conversations that once seemed insignificant. They may think about moments of support, patience, understanding, or affection that they previously accepted without much thought. The relationship begins existing as a complete picture rather than a collection of immediate frustrations. And sometimes that complete picture looks very different from the version they were focused on while it was unfolding in real time. This creates an emotional conflict that few avoidants openly discuss. On one side, there may be genuine relief. Relief from expectations, relief from emotional intensity, relief from the pressure they often associate with closeness. Yet on the other side exists something harder to define. A sense of loss, a recognition that freedom and absence are not always the same thing. Many people assume that if someone values independence, losing a relationship should feel easy. But independence doesn't erase attachment. Wanting space doesn't eliminate emotional investment. A person can simultaneously appreciate distance and miss the person who is no longer there. They can enjoy the reduction of pressure while grieving the disappearance of connection. This contradiction creates an internal tension that is difficult to explain because both experiences feel true at the same time. One part of them appreciates the freedom, another part quietly notices what freedom cost. One part remembers why distance felt necessary. Another part remembers why the relationship mattered. These competing emotions don't always resolve quickly. Instead, they often coexist, creating a lingering emotional complexity that many people never see from the outside. And that complexity is exactly why this type of goodbye becomes so difficult to forget. Dramatic endings often create immediate emotional intensity, but they also provide clear explanations. People can point to the argument, they can point to the betrayal, they can point to the explosive final conversation and tell themselves that's why everything ended. But a calm goodbye leaves behind something different. It leaves behind unanswered reflection. There is no dramatic villain, no obvious emotional explosion, no single moment that neatly explains everything. Instead, there is simply a person who reached a place of acceptance, a person who stopped fighting reality, a person who chose peace over endless emotional struggle. That kind of ending tends to linger because it resists easy categorization. It can't be dismissed as irrational, it can't be blamed on a temporary emotional outburst, it stands there quietly asking to be understood rather than argued against, and because of that it often leaves a deeper psychological imprint than chaos ever could. Long after dramatic endings are forgotten, calm endings can remain surprisingly vivid because they invite reflection instead of resistance. Perhaps the most difficult realization arrives when they begin understanding the difference between losing control and losing someone. During many relationship dynamics, especially those involving emotional distance, people become accustomed to certain patterns. They assume those patterns will continue. They assume certain people will remain available. They assume there will always be another opportunity later. When a goodbye finally arrives, the first discomfort isn't always about losing the relationship itself. Sometimes it's about losing certainty, losing familiarity, losing the ability to predict what comes next. But over time, a deeper realization begins forming. This isn't merely the loss of a dynamic, this is the loss of a person who occupied a meaningful place in their life, and those are not the same thing. One challenges expectations. The other touches the heart. The longer they sit with that distinction, the harder it becomes to ignore, because eventually the question is no longer whether the pattern can be restored. The question becomes whether they truly understood the value of what they had while they still had it. And that question has a way of following people much longer than they ever expected. And once that question takes root, something else often follows close behind: regret. Regret is one of the most misunderstood emotions because people imagine it arrives immediately after a loss. They picture someone instantly realizing what they had, instantly understanding every mistake, instantly wanting another chance. Real life is rarely that simple. Regret often moves slowly. It arrives after the noise fades, after the distractions lose their effectiveness, after enough time has passed for perspective to develop. That's especially true for people who are accustomed to creating emotional distance. In the beginning, distance can feel like relief. Relief can feel like certainty.